In the winter light of a French laboratory in 1908, Marcellin Boule examined the bones of a skeleton that seemed to have climbed out of another world. The bones had come from a limestone hollow near La Chapelle au Sein, a quiet village in central France, where 3 men had uncovered something far older than a grave, far stranger than a medieval burial, and far more disturbing than an animal skeleton trapped in cave earth. On the table before Boule lay a skull with a heavy brow, a long, low cranial vault, a great face pushed forward beneath the nose, a jaw almost emptied of teeth, and a body marked by age, injury, disease, and survival. It was not simply an ancient person. It was the first nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton ever placed before a scientist with enough authority to define what an entire kind of human was supposed to be. And in that room, under the lamps of early 20th century France, the old man from La Chapelle became something larger than himself. He became the image of the Neanderthal. The deeper you look at that moment, the stranger it becomes, because Boule was not merely looking at bones, he was looking at a question that Europe had not yet learned how to ask properly. Neanderthal bones had been found before in Germany, Belgium, Gibraltar and elsewhere, but fragments are easier to argue away. A skull cap can be called diseased, a jaw can be called primitive, a brow ridge can be explained as pathology, brutishness or error. But a skeleton is harder to dismiss. A skeleton has proportions, a skeleton has posture, a skeleton has a body plan. The old man from La Chapelle forced science to confront the possibility that Europe had once been inhabited by another human form, not a monster, not an ape, not a deformed peasant from a forgotten graveyard, but a population with its own history, its own anatomy, its own tools, and its own way of enduring the Ice Age. Boule saw the importance of this immediately. That is why his work carried so much force. He was not a minor observer writing from the edge of the field. He was one of the most respected paleontologists in France, trained in the anatomy of extinct animals, confident in comparative form, and working in a scientific culture that still imagined evolution as a ladder, with some beings higher, some lower, and modern humanity standing near the top. When he reconstructed the La Chapelle skeleton between 1911 and 1913, he gave the world a Neanderthal with a bent spine, flexed knees, a thrust-forward head, a slouching gait, and a body that seemed trapped halfway between humanity and animality. The answer was powerful because it felt visible. Anyone could look at the drawing and understand the message. This was not us. This was a failed branch. This was the old world before the human body had fully straightened itself. And yet the tragedy of Boule is that he was wrong in exactly the way that made him unforgettable. He mistook an elderly, damaged individual for the pattern of a whole population. The old man from La Chapelle had lost most of his teeth long before death. His lower jaw had remodeled around empty sockets. His joints carried the marks of arthritis. His spine and hips were altered by age and strain. He was not a perfect anatomical template. He was a survivor. He had lived long enough for his body to become a record of pain, endurance, and care. Later re-examinations showed that Neanderthals were not stooped half-apes shuffling through the Ice Age with bent knees and broken posture. They stood upright. They walked efficiently. Their lower limbs were powerful. Their trunks were broad. Their bones were thick, not because they were primitive failures, but because they were built for a brutal physical world. That was where things stood for much of the 20th century. Boule's Neanderthal remained in the public imagination even after anatomy had begun to correct him. The museum image outlived the skeleton. The hunched caveman became a cultural fossil, copied into books, cartoons, murals, school charts and films. Every time someone pictured a Neanderthal as dim, shambling and defeated, a shadow of La Chapelle was still there. But the actual old man, the individual beneath the myth, was quietly becoming more interesting than the caricature made from him. His missing teeth raised a question that no stooped ape image could answer. How did a man with almost no working teeth survive in an Ice Age group? How did he chew? How did he eat tough meat, roots, hides, or plant matter? The simplest answer is that he was not alone. Someone helped him. Someone shared food. Someone tolerated weakness. Someone kept an old man alive in a world where old age itself was an achievement. Now consider this. Boule was wrong about posture, wrong about the shuffling gait, wrong about the degree of distance between Neanderthals and ourselves. But he was also prophetic in a way that later science has never fully escaped. He understood that La Chapelle was not just a modern human with unusual bones. He understood that Neanderthals were real. He understood that their anatomy had coherence. He understood that they belonged to a population with deep time behind it. The mistake was not that he separated them from modern humanity. The mistake was that he separated them too absolutely, turning difference into inferiority, anatomy into destiny, and one old injured man into the symbol of an entire vanished people. Then the cameras became sharper. The bones were measured again. The spine was reconsidered. The pelvis, limbs, skull and teeth were placed beside a growing archive of other Neanderthals from France, Croatia, Spain, Germany, Iraq and Siberia. Each comparison took Boule's creature apart and replaced it with something more formidable. Neanderthals had huge nasal openings, projecting faces, strong hands, thick limb bones and bodies with enormous muscle attachments. Their cranial capacity was often as large as that of living people, sometimes larger. Their brains were not small, but shaped differently, longer from front to back, less rounded in the parietal region, with a cranial architecture that had its own evolutionary path. They were not failed humans waiting to be replaced. They were a northern and western Eurasian solution to the Ice Age, refined across hundreds of thousands of years. There is a thing that happens when old bones meet new instruments. They stop being simple. A skull that once seemed to answer a question begins asking several more. A jaw that once proved primitiveness begins to speak about diet, survival, social care, and ancestry. A cave burial that once looked like a curiosity begins to raise questions about memory, group identity, and the treatment of the dead. La Chapelle did this over and over again. The more carefully scientists examined the site, the less comfortable the old story became. The body appeared to have been placed in a depression, protected rapidly from scavengers and disturbance. The claim of deliberate burial has never been accepted by everyone, but it has never gone away either. The old man sits at the center of one of the deepest questions in paleoanthropology. When did human concern for the dead become something archaeologically visible? That question matters because burial is not just disposal. Burial suggests attention. It suggests that a body mattered after breath stopped. It suggests that the group recognized the individual as more than meat, more than a carcass, more than an object. In La Chapelle, the old man's condition makes the problem sharper. If his people kept him alive despite severe tooth loss and chronic pain, and then placed his body with care, then the Neanderthal story becomes morally uncomfortable for the old caricature. The stooped brute turns into an elderly man inside a social world. The failed branch turns into a community. The primitive creature turns into someone who had companions, habits, pain, and a final place among those who knew him. Then came genetics, and the old man's world changed again. In 1997, the first Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA sequence from another specimen shocked the field by proving that genetic material could survive from deep prehistory. In 2010, the first draft Neanderthal genome changed the story even more dramatically. The finding was not just that Neanderthals were different. The finding was that they were inside many of us. People whose ancestry lies outside sub-Saharan Africa generally carry a small proportion of Neanderthal DNA, often around 1 to 2%, with variation across populations. The creature Boule had placed outside the human story had not vanished cleanly. Neanderthals had crossed into the ancestry of living people. Every resolution after that made the story harder to place, not easier. At first, interbreeding sounded like a single event, a brief encounter somewhere in Western Asia or nearby regions as Homo sapiens expanded across Eurasia. Then better genomes began to show a more intricate pattern. Some early modern humans carried recent Neanderthal ancestors only a few generations back. Others, even very early in Europe, carried the older shared Neanderthal ancestry, but not a recent local Neanderthal parent or grandparent. By late 2024, new analyses narrowed the major shared pulse of Neanderthal ancestry in the ancestors of living non-African populations to roughly 49,000 to 45,000 years ago in one study, while another placed a broader interval between roughly 50,500 and 43,500 years ago. The answer was not a single night in a cave, and not a simple replacement. It was an extended human frontier. This is where Boule becomes uncomfortable again. He imagined Neanderthals as separate. Genetics says they were not separate enough to prevent children. He imagined them as archaic outsiders. Genetics says their immune variants, skin-related variants, metabolism-related variants, and other inherited fragments persisted, because some of those fragments helped later people survive. But genetics also says the connection was not seamless. Neanderthal DNA is unevenly distributed across the modern genome. Some regions retain it, other regions are nearly empty of it. That means interbreeding happened, but natural selection filtered the inheritance afterward. The two populations were compatible, yet not identical. They were connected, yet not interchangeable. Boule's hard wall collapsed, but a subtle boundary remained. The older view said Neanderthals disappeared because they were inferior. The newer view is stranger. Their populations were small. Their groups were scattered. Their genetic diversity was low compared with later expanding human populations. Some Neanderthal genomes show signs of close biological kinship within small communities. DNA from Siberian caves has revealed father and daughter relationships, extended kin connections, and groups that were narrow enough genetically to feel less like vast nations than fragile bands moving through immense landscapes. That is not a picture of stupidity. It is a picture of vulnerability. A people can be intelligent, skilled, caring, physically powerful, and still lose ground if their communities are too small, too isolated, too exposed to climatic shocks, disease, shifting prey, and competition with expanding neighbours. The old man from La Chapelle suddenly looks different in that genetic light. He is not just a skeleton misread by Boule. He is a representative of a world under pressure. His body shows age and survival. His species shows endurance and contraction. His people had occupied Eurasia for an immense span of time, through cold phases, warm phases, animal migrations, volcanic winters, changing forests, open steppe, and endless local extinctions and returns.
The Neanderthals had a long and successful evolutionary history. They evolved and survived in Europe over a period of at least 200,000 years. But in that time they also developed their own special features, and these occurred through the skeleton, but in particular they're concentrated in the face. The face is dominated by the nose, a very large and projecting nose, and the whole middle of the face is pulled forwards, taking with it the teeth as well. And for me, this in particular marks them off as something different, probably a different species from us. And this is difficult to grasp in a sense because we're saying that they were human beings, there's no doubt about that, and yet they were different kinds of human beings, different from us, not part of our lineage, not our ancestors.
Yet the DNA suggests that by the final chapters of their story, many Neanderthal groups were demographically thin. They were not a single unified people stretching smoothly from France to Siberia. They were a mosaic of regional populations, some deeply separated, some replaced by other Neanderthals, before Homo sapiens even arrived in force. That is one of the great reversals of the new genetics. The disappearance of Neanderthals did not begin as a simple encounter between them and us. Neanderthal populations had their own internal history of turnover, migration, isolation, and collapse. Western European Neanderthals were not identical to Siberian Neanderthals. Late Neanderthals were not identical to earlier ones. Some lineages vanished and were replaced by other Neanderthal lineages. The final contact with Homo sapiens occurred inside a much older pattern of fragmentation. The last Neanderthals were already the heirs of many Neanderthal disappearances. This makes La Chapelle more mysterious, not less. In Boule's time, the old man seemed to explain Neanderthals. Then later anatomy explained away Boule's errors. Then burial studies made the old man socially complex. Then genetics made Neanderthals relatives. Then deeper genomics made them fragile, structured, admixed, and demographically unusual. The famous skeleton did not become clearer. It became layered. He was a man with arthritis and tooth loss. He was a member of a group that cared enough to keep him alive. He belonged to a population that was both deeply distinct and genetically entangled with the ancestors of living people. He stood at the center of a scientific reversal in which almost everything first said about him was corrected, but not everything first suspected about his difference was erased. Boule, in that sense, was both villain and prophet, though neither word captures him cleanly. He gave the world a false posture and a damaging image. But he also forced Neanderthals into scientific reality. He made them impossible to dismiss as diseased modern humans. He treated Chapelle as the key to an extinct human population, and on that central point he was right. His error was interpretive arrogance. His insight was taxonomic seriousness. He saw a pattern, but he over-hardened it. He saw difference, but he turned difference into a hierarchy. He saw an ancient human, but he could not imagine how human that ancient form truly was. The new DNA findings have not made Neanderthals simply like us. That would be too easy, and it would only replace one myth with another. They were not modern people in heavy bodies. Their skulls were different. Their development was different. Their population history was different. Their extinction was real. The genetic exchange with Homo sapiens did not save them as a visible population, but their DNA also means they are not gone in the way Boule's generation imagined. They disappeared as a separate people, while fragments of them persisted inside later humanity. The old man from Chapelle became a fossil. His cousins became ancestry. There is something almost cruel about how the science has unfolded. The more we learn, the more the old categories fail. Species, ancestor, cousin, replacement, extinction, survival, human, non-human, primitive, advanced. Each word feels too clean for what the evidence now shows. The Neanderthal story is not a ladder. It is not a straight road. It is a braided landscape of small groups, repeated contacts, partial absorption, local losses, and biological echoes that still sit quietly inside living genomes. Boule's skeleton once seemed to mark a boundary. Now it marks a threshold. And the threshold is still moving. New techniques are beginning to recover more from less. Proteins from fragments, DNA from sediments, ancestry from tiny broken pieces of bone, development from inner ear shape, behavior from microscopic wear, climate from cave minerals, mobility from isotopes, and family structure from genomes that once seemed impossible to obtain. Each method returns to the old questions and changes their shape. The question is no longer whether Neanderthals were brutes. That answer is gone. The question is what kind of humanity they represented, how many times they met Homo sapiens, how much they gave, how much they received, and why a population strong enough to survive Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years finally passed out of sight. In 1908, Boule looked at the old man and saw a creature bent beneath the weight of evolution. In the 1950s, anatomists looked again and saw that the bend belonged more to age and arthritis than to Neanderthal nature. In 2010, geneticists looked again and saw that the boundary between Neanderthal and modern human had been crossed. In 2024, broader genomic work looked again and saw that the crossing had a tighter time frame, a deeper structure, and a stronger evolutionary aftermath than earlier models allowed. Every generation returned to the same vanished people with better tools, and every generation found that the previous image was partly wrong. For now, the old man from Chapelle still lies at the center of the story, not because he tells us everything, but because he warns us how easily a single skeleton can become a myth. He was old. He was damaged. He was cared for. He was misread. He became the face of a species, and then the evidence against the caricature of that species. He is one of the most important individuals ever found in the study of human origins, not because he gives a final answer, but because he keeps refusing to stay inside the answers made for him. The mystery now is not whether Boule made mistakes. He did. The mystery is why the corrected Neanderthal is even more unsettling than the mistaken one. A stooped brute is easy to dismiss. A powerful, intelligent, social, genetically entangled human population is not. A failed ape man can be placed safely outside the family. A vanished cousin whose DNA still shapes living bodies cannot. The old man from Chapelle began as evidence for distance. He has become evidence for intimacy. And that is why his story is not finished. Thank you for watching. The old man from La Chapelle was once forced to carry the weight of an entire extinct people on his bent and arthritic bones. Now, more than a century later, the weight has shifted. The mistake was not that science looked too closely at him. The mistake was that it stopped looking too soon. Every new method has returned to Neanderthals with sharper eyes, and every sharper view has made them less simple, less distant, and far more difficult to explain away. Please like and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden history of human origins. I will see you in the next one.